Hey everyone, today I'm really excited to be doing a video on my Ikea Sonos hacking series. This video is intended to really sum up all the different ideas in one video that will answer all of your questions and explain every possible way to hook a powered sub up to your Sonos system on the cheap. And this video is going to be pretty epic. We're going to cover how to hook it up to a stereo system, a home theater system, creating a subwoofer zone, and also using it to bi-amp any old pair of passive speakers. So let's jump in. So before we get into wiring, it's important to understand what speaker level inputs mean on a powered subwoofer, because that's how this technique works. So if you look at any old receiver, some of the higher end ones and more modern ones will have a subwoofer output, essentially an RCA output on the back that provides just the bass frequencies that you can plug into a subwoofer. But not all receivers have that. In fact, a lot of older ones don't, and budget receivers don't have it. So if you look at many popular subwoofers on the market and you look in the back panel, in addition to the RCA inputs, you'll see a pair of speaker terminals, and sometimes two pairs. And what these high level or speaker level inputs do on a subwoofer is provide a way for you to just take a powered signal that would normally just go into a speaker and route it into the subwoofer as a way to provide a signal. And one of the first questions I got on my videos is this bad for my Sonos? Will this break the amp somehow? And the answer to that is no. So if you look on the web and you research this, essentially the way a speaker level input on a sub works is it has a very high impedance load, which basically just means that it's not going to be pulling really any current from the amplifier, which means it really doesn't present any sort of strain on the amp. This example even says that you could have 6 of these powered subwoofers hooked up to an amp and it would be no problem at all. In fact, when I was researching this, some of the high-end sites said that the speaker level inputs are actually better than the RCA inputs because there's a little bit less delay. So I would say go ahead, don't be worried about this. This won't hurt your amp, and it might actually even sound better than an RCA signal. Another question I hear quite a bit is whether or not this technique will work on other Sonos speakers or whether this only applies to the Ikea Symfonisk speaker. And the answer to that, luckily, is this will work on absolutely any Sonos speaker. So whether it's a Play 1, Play 5, Play Bar, Beam, you can actually use this technique on any Sonos speaker. The only thing you need to be able to do is to be able to open up the cabinet and get access to the woofer terminals. And in fact, this isn't even Sonos only. You can use this technique to hook into any sort of powered speaker, whether it be Bluetooth or just a pair of desktop monitors, and jump off the woofer terminal and use that as a way to get a signal into a powered sub. And another question that comes up all the time is, what if I only have RCA inputs on my powered sub? How do I make this technique work? So this is an example of a sub here. You can see it only has RCAs in the back. It does not have speaker level inputs. This is an energy sub that I have. You can see it only has RCAs. That does not mean that you're out of luck. So there are these great little converters. What these do is these have speaker wires on one side. You can wire that in, and on the other side, it provides a RCA signal. So this is a safe way to connect a powered amplified signal and convert it down into a much smaller RCA signal so that it won't hurt the inputs on the amplifier. And regardless of which model you choose, they all connect up the same way. So let's take a look at a wiring diagram here. So this on the right-hand side is representing the amplifier inside the Symfonisk speaker. You basically take the positive and negative signal from the woofer, you run it through one of these boxes, and then you plug an RCA cable from there into the powered sub. It's that simple. All right, so now that we understand how we get a signal into our powered sub, let's talk a little bit about how we get into the Sonos speaker in order to get the signal out. So first of all, you need to get inside your Sonos speaker. So this is an example of a Play 3. If you look online, there's probably a teardown video that shows you how to disassemble the speaker and get inside. And the symphonic speaker is probably the easiest one to open up. You essentially take the little pegs that hold the grill off. You can use needle nose pliers for that. And behind that, you'll see a series of Phillips screws. Just use a screwdriver to take those off. Stick your finger in the port and then pull really, really hard, and the front cover will come off. And before you start yanking the cover all the way off, you will need to release the ribbon cable, and you do that by flipping the little switch that holds the ribbon cable down, and then you can disconnect the wire terminals. Once inside, the next thing we want to do is we actually want to jump off of the woofer and get a wire to the outside world. And you can see they're pretty straightforward connectors here. And all we want to do is take a wire and attach it to the positive and negative on the woofer. I'd recommend using, say, 16 gauge pure copper wire. And you can attach it in a couple different ways. You can wrap it on there. You can use a terminal. Whatever works for you. You can solder it on. You can hot glue it on. It doesn't really matter as long as there's this really strong electrical connection that won't come loose. Once we have the wire hooked up to the woofer and the woofer amp, we need to actually get that outside of the cabinet. So that's where binding posts come into play. There's all sorts of different binding posts out in the world. It's up to you on which style you want to use and where to put it on the cabinet. I ended up using really simple ones where I could just drill holes. One thing to note is that if you're using a speaker, say like the Play 1 here, you see there's not a lot of room. So you're going to have to get creative where you place these binding posts. If you look in the symphonic speaker, you see there's actually a nice big blank spot in the top back. That gives us a great spot to put a binding post and switches, and you'll see that later on. And so this is an example of what it looks like when it's finished. Now, I did want to note that I have a lot of binding posts and a lot of switches, and that's so that I can do lots of different things. You'll see as the video goes on that you can get by with a much simpler setup than what I have. All right, so one more thing we need to cover is what's actually going on inside your Sonos. So first of all, there is the Sonos CPU, and so that is a processor that handles the streaming duties, but it also has a digital crossover, and that's where the TruePlay DSP or digital signal processing happens. So essentially, all of the processing happens in a computer, in software. And then the output of that goes into a digital to analog converter, a DAC. And that's where the digital signal is converted into an analog signal that can then be passed into the tweeter amplifier and the woofer amplifier. And then that in turn is connected to the two drivers. And I think it's important for everyone to understand, at least conceptually, how the Sonos is set up inside, because that leads us to one of the most common questions I always get is, hey, can we just get a full range signal out of this symphonic speaker? And the answer to that is, well, no, because as I explained, the signal is split up between the highs and the lows for the woofer and the tweeter amplifiers in software inside the computer, essentially. So there is no place on the board, as far as I know, where there is actually a full range signal that you could just tap into. So in order to make a signal that's full range come out of this as an output, you basically would need to hack into the firmware and do a lot of trickery and a lot of wiring, which is well beyond what I can do. But I did do an experiment and had a video on how I used the speaker level to RCA signal converter to basically take the tweeter amp and the woofer amp and convert it back to a signal, and then use a Y connector to basically mush those together into a full range signal. So I did that basically on the analog side of things instead of the digital. It kind of works okay, but the sound quality is not fantastic. But if you want to learn more about that, check out that video. All right, so let's get into the meat of things here. So first of all, if you have a symphonic or any sort of Sonos speaker and you just want to add some bass, let's talk about how to do that. So step one is the easiest thing you can do. So this is the least amount of work. So we're just going to take a single Sonos speaker, a single symphonic, and hook it up to an active subwoofer. So if we look here on the right-hand side, this is a simple diagram showing the two amps inside the symphonic hooked up to the woofer and the tweeter. And what we want to do essentially is just wrap a wire or connect the positive and negative from the woofer and run that to a binding post on the back of the speaker, and then connect the positive and negative to the high level or speaker level input on the back of your powered sub. And this is what the back of your Symfonisk would look like once you added that single set of binding posts. So super simple, super easy. If you don't even want to put a binding post, you could honestly just take a drill, make a hole, and make sure it's airtight by putting a big blob of hot glue and calling it a day. Now, before people start yelling at me, I think it's important to realize that there are different skill levels, and we want to make this as easy as possible for people to get into. You can obviously go whole hog and you can solder everything, put binding posts and switches and everything else, but it's not really required. All we really need is to get a wire from the woofer amp into our sub. So whatever works for you, works for me. All right, so we've done the most basic thing here, but let's move on to more advanced approaches. So again, if we have a stereo pair, there is going to be a little bit of stereo information on the low end. So if we did want to capture both sides to send it to our sub, you can basically just repeat this same process, right? So we can hook the other speaker up and we can wire it exactly the same way. So the wiring is identical to a single speaker. You just do it twice, and then you hook that into both the left and right on your powered sub. So I just want to say that probably one channel is enough for most people, unless you're real picky. So don't worry if you're just doing one. So yeah, left plus right is going to be a little bit better, but it's going to be fairly subtle. So what we can do though is we can take this to the next level really by making this into a true subwoofer satellite setup. So if you take a look at your active subwoofer, you'll see there's always a knob for the low pass crossover, and that's essentially the point at which the sub stops getting signal. So it's only operating below that frequency. And so what we want to do is make it so that the Symfonisk isn't working nearly as hard. And we can do that by using the outputs on the subwoofer to filter out the bass from the Symfonisk. And so when that happens, we basically are creating a crossover frequency between the sub and the Symfonisk. And so we're essentially turning it into basically a three-way system, or what's called a 2.1 system. So let's take a look at how we would wire that up. So first of all, what we want to do is completely disconnect the woofer from the bass amplifier. And we want to take the output of the bass amplifier, connect it to a binding post, and then connect that to the input on our sub. So that's very similar to what we did originally, except you see the woofer is not connected. And what we want to do then is use the output on our active sub, which has that high pass filter applied, which means it filters out the bass. And we want to use that to connect to another binding post on the back of the Symfonisk and use that to run into the woofer. So essentially we're putting the powered sub in between the amplifier and the woofer so that we can filter out the bass. And looking at the back of our Symfonisk, you're going to see how we're going to hook it up. So we first of all have our binding post that is the output, which means this is connected from the bass amplifier in the Symfonisk, and that's going to the input on our active sub. And then we're going to have a second pair of binding posts that will be the output of the active sub, and that is what connects to the internal woofer in the Symfonisk speaker. Now, obviously, because we're running two sets of wires, we're going to probably want to keep this wiring setup as tidy as possible. So I would recommend tracking down some wire that has 4 conductors in it. That is the gauge that you need, and that'll just make everything look a lot tidier if you're going to go with this approach. And obviously, if we're doing this, we want to do it for both the left and right speakers so that they are balanced. So do this for both. So obviously this is a lot more work, but I do think it will sound significantly better. You'll have much less distortion in the Symfonisk because they're obviously not working as hard, they're not going as deep, but it'll also eliminate overlap between the sub and the Symfonisk in the mid bass, so it should clean that up as well. So it definitely sounds better. Whether or not it's worth the hassle is really up to you and how picky you are. So I think it's a really great option if you have the time and energy to do it. All right, now that we have stereo out of the way, let's talk about home theater. And so the way home theater works in Sonos is it does require that you either start with a beam or a play bar. So you can't use any old speakers and get the Sonos Dolby Digital encoding. So you got to start with one of those two products. But what we want to do here is we want to use a pair of inexpensive rear channels like the Symfoniks and use an inexpensive active sub to come up with a much cheaper home theater system that will save you at least $1,000 compared to using say a pair of Play Ones and a official Sonos sub. All right, so the whole technique here is predicated on the fact that the surround sound speakers in a Sonos setup actually get quite a bit of bass information. I always assumed it would filter that out, but there is low end that rumbles all the way to 20 hertz on the rear channels. So what we want to do is wire this up just like we wired up the stereo one. So we basically are taking the easy approach. We're just jumping a wire off of the woofer, adding it to a binding post, and hooking that to the input on our active sub. And ideally we do that for both the left and right channels just to make sure we're capturing as much as possible. And so on the wiring diagram, again, it's going to be the same as always. We're just going to do this on both sides. And on the back of our Symfoniks, we'll have our subwoofer outputs for both speakers. Now we can take this further. We can use that .1 example that we showed before in a home theater context. And so this is all about removing the bass from the Symfoniks so that they'll sound cleaner and louder. And so again, what we're going to do here is we will disconnect the woofer from the amp. We'll run it into the input on the active sub and use the output on the sub to plug into our Symfonic speaker woofer so that it filters out the low end bass. And looking around the back of the Symfonic speaker, it will have that set up with two binding posts, one for the output going to the active sub and one as the input coming from the output on the sub into our woofer. And on a setup like this, I definitely would recommend doing both the left and right channels, so do this on both sides. All right, so moving on, we had a lot of feedback around whether or not this is a legitimate Dolby Digital 5.1 setup. And so let's start by even talking about what that means. So in a classic 5.1 setup, we have a pair of front speakers. We have a pair of rear surround speakers, a center channel, and a subwoofer. And if you add up the 5 primary speakers, that's how you end up with the 5 in 5.1. And the subwoofer is .1 as we learned earlier. So that's how we end up with what a 5.1 Dolby Digital setup is. And if you look at this in the Sonos world, basically what we're doing is we're taking the left, right, and center and accomplishing all of those channels in one small box, either the beam or the play bar. So you can see there's already quite a bit of compromise. We're jamming all this stuff into a tiny box. On the surround sound side of things are a lot clearer. Our left and right rear channels are 1-for-1 with whatever we choose in a Sonos system, in this case the Symfoniks. So that is very clear in terms of mapping. And then the last piece of the puzzle is the .1 channel, right? So that's our subwoofer. In the Sonos world, if we choose to use the official Sonos subwoofer, that again is a perfect 1-to-1 with the Dolby Digital 5.1 setup. But in this situation, what we're trying to do is avoid that really expensive piece of equipment and come up with something else. And so really what we're doing here is, yes, we're not using that .1 channel at all. And instead what we're doing is we're harvesting low-end information from the surround speakers, that channel. So yes, we're going to be getting different information. There might be things encoded in the .1 channel that we're not going to see at all in this hacky setup. All right, so to summarize, is this a perfectly legit Dolby Digital 5.1 setup? No, but let's be honest, Sonos is already a compromise, and so you're already missing out on some information. And specifically, there might be things that are encoded in that subwoofer channel that you're not going to hear, but in my experience, you're really not missing much. You're still going to hear a ton of rumble, a ton of low end, and it sounds great. So if you don't want to spend the $800 on a sub, give it a try. It doesn't take much work, and it sounds really great in my opinion. That covers the first two scenarios, so a stereo and home theater. But there's going to be situations where maybe you just want to use this symphonic hack as a way to add a subwoofer as a separate room so that you could group it with any old room in your Sonos system. So in this mode, I'm calling it the gateway approach. And really what we want to do here is turn off the drivers inside the Symfonisk and just use it as a way to get a signal into a powered sub. So the way we go about wiring this is we want to completely disconnect the internal drivers, and we can do that by using wire caps or electrical tape. You just don't want those things shorting out. And then what we want is to take the wire that would normally go in the woofer, plug that into our binding post on the back, and plug that into the input on our sub. And on the back of the Symfonisk speaker, we would just have our single set of binding posts for the subwoofer output. Once this is all set up in the Sonos app, you'll see that you can then set your Symfonisk up. You can give it a name like I did here to call it Symfonisk Sub. It'll never actually show up as a subwoofer, but you can use that name. And then you can go ahead and group that with any old room that you'd like. And that is how you can then basically add a powered sub as a separate room. Now, it's important to remember that when you do a grouping like this, the volume is not locked unless you're using the app. So if you use the volume control on the speaker, that will not change the volume on the sub. So that is one big downside with this approach. And if you're like me and you don't want to fully commit to always having the internal drivers disconnected, you can use a switch to choose whether or not they're on or off. So that gives you the flexibility to use it as a regular speaker or to use it as a gateway as we described. So if we take a look at the simplified wiring inside here, here's our woofer amp. Here's our woofer. It's connected directly to it. We're jumping off the amp and hooking that to a binding post. So that is how we're going to provide a signal to our subwoofer. And then what we can do conceptually is add a switch between the amp and the driver. And what we can do is just attach it either to the negative or the positive. It doesn't really make a difference. What we're doing with this switch though is we're interrupting that circuit. So when it's in the off position, it's not a completed circuit, and so no power from the amp will flow to the driver. And you'll also notice in this diagram that, yes, the binding post is always hot, meaning that it's always connected to the amp. And there's really no need to have that part switched, in my opinion. You can just not hook something up to it if you don't want to use it. So it's that simple. And I got a lot of questions about, well, what kind of switch should I buy? And the answer is pretty simple in this case. You don't want to get an AC switch. Let's stick to DC switches only. And you just need one that has 2 conductors, like 2 pins. So very simple. They come in lots and lots of shapes and sizes. This one looks like a missile launcher. So basically pick one that looks the way you want it to look and that will fit on the cabinet in a way that you want. So it's really up to you. So putting all this together, let's look at the real world wiring diagram. So what I'm essentially doing here is I'm taking our DC switch and I'm placing it in between the amplifier and the negative terminal on the woofer and the tweeter. So it's really that simple. I'm just interrupting the flow there. So we want a wire that goes from the amplifier to one side of the switch, and the other side of the switch gets connected to the negative on the driver. So very simple conceptually, even if the diagrams look a little bit messier. And then if we look at the back of the speaker, we have our subwoofer output, and we have our switches. So now with this setup, you can choose whether or not to turn off the internal drivers and just use this as a gateway, or turn them on and use it as a regular speaker with or without the external subwoofer. So the fourth and final thing that we can do is we can use the Symfonisk speaker as a way to bi-amplify any passive two-way speaker on the market. And I think this is really exciting. So this can be used to amplify, a modern speaker. It could be a classic speaker. It could be floor standing. It can be a ceiling speaker, an in-wall speaker. Any two-way speaker will work in this application. So I think this is actually the most exciting thing that you can do. And I've had great luck with this. So let's talk a little bit about how it works. So the first thing we need to do is we need to remove any sort of passive crossover in our speaker. So typically in a speaker, there's one wire that comes from your amplifier, and inside the speaker box, there is a passive crossover that divides the frequencies into signal for the woofer and the tweeter. And so what we want to do in this application is we want to completely remove that from the signal path. So we take that out and we just want a straight wire from the woofer to a binding post. And we want to do the same thing for the tweeter. So that will usually require adding another binding post to the back of our speaker. And if you have a pair of passive speakers that are already set up for bi-wiring, like you can see here, you're in business. All you need to do is bypass the internal passive crossovers and you're good to go. And if your speakers don't happen to have dual binding posts in the back, no problem. You can install a binding post. And if you're not fully committed to this technique or you're worried about damaging your cabinets, if you have ported speakers, it's okay to even just run the wire out the port and use that. So it can be as simple as you want it to be. All right, so let's take a look at the wiring for this. On the Symfonisk side of things, it's actually really simple. We just want to get into our Symfonisk and completely disconnect the woofer and the tweeter and attach those to binding posts. So at this point, just like in the gateway model, we want to just use the Symfonisk as an amplifier and not use the internal drivers. And so looking around the back of the speaker, you'll see there's a woofer output and a tweeter output. Again, in this situation, I would recommend going ahead and adding switches so that you have the flexibility to continue to use the Symfonisk speaker as a plain old Sonos speaker with or without the external sub. And then you can flip the switches off and use this as a way to biamp your speakers. And this is the exact setup that I have on my Symfonisk speakers. And that explains why I've got all these switches and binding posts, because I actually think using this for biamping is the most exciting feature. And remember, you can then combine this with that technique of adding an external active subwoofer by jumping off the woofer terminals. So these are not mutually exclusive ideas. So you can combine the biamping with an external sub for a really high quality 2.1 system just using these really inexpensive Symfonisk speakers. So there are a few considerations to keep in mind when selecting drivers or speakers to biamplify this way. So the first one is driver sensitivity. And sensitivity is really just a measure of how much audio output in decibels you're going to get if you give it 1 watt of power. So imagine we were biamplifying a pair of speakers that use this woofer and tweeter. The tweeter is rated at 91 dB and the woofer is 88. So there's going to be 3 decibels more sound coming out of the tweeter relative to the woofer, which might make it sound overly bright. Now, TruePlay can deal with that to a certain extent, but it's something to keep in mind, and you want to keep the sensitivity as close as possible to each other. Now, the next thing is driver impedance. So when I measured the impedance of the drivers, it seems like the woofer is about 4 ohms and the tweeter is about 8 ohms. So as a general recommendation, you want to be using drivers that are between 4 and 8 ohms, and the closer you can stay to that, the better. And I had a lot of feedback from people in the comments kind of freaking out and saying, if you don't have the impedance exactly matched, everything's going to be broken. And I think a lot of that is a reaction to how passive crossovers are designed. So passive crossovers are very much tied to the impedance of the driver. So in this very simple 6 decibel per octave crossover, you can see that just by changing the impedance of the driver from 4 to 8 ohms completely shifts the crossover frequency by a factor of 2, right? So that would be very, very bad. But in this case, because we're electronically crossing these things over, the impedance really doesn't have that same kind of an effect, at least on the crossover frequency. That's handled at really the CPU level. But what's important to understand is that the driver impedance will result in a subtle change in output. So, if you have an 8 ohm woofer hooked up to this and the amp is sort of tuned for a 4 ohm load, it will be 3 decibels quieter. So again, TruePlay can deal with some of these small changes. 3 dB is not a big deal to compensate for, but that is something to keep in mind. And definitely don't present a load lower than 4 ohms because that's going to be really taxing on the amplifier. And the third major consideration is the frequency response or range that the woofer and tweeter have. And really what we want to make sure is that those two things have plenty of overlap. So that's what we're calling driver range here. And as far as I can tell, it seems like the crossover frequency on the Symfonisk is in the ballpark of 3000 hertz. So I can't tell exactly, but that's the ballpark. And that's typical for a two-way speaker in general. So if we take a look at this Vifa 1-inch tweeter, you can see it's rated all the way down to 1100 hertz up to 20,000. And so what we care about here is the low frequency response of the tweeter. We don't want a tweeter that will be struggling to make it down to 3000 hertz. Like if it's only rated at 3,000 or 4,000 hertz, that tweeter might be in danger of getting blown out because it's really right at its low end. So you want to pick the right tweeter that can handle being crossed over around 3000 hertz. The same goes with woofers. So we want the woofer to be able to have a smooth response all the way up to that crossover frequency of 3000. So if we look at this smaller driver here, you can see that has no problem at all making it well beyond 3000 hertz. So I have a lot of confidence that this will sound really smooth and good. As you get up to larger and larger drivers, like this 18-inch driver, just to really accentuate it, you can see that this thing really struggles with any sort of output, even above 1000 hertz. So this would be a good example where you'd essentially have a lot of breakup and distortion and a really poor overlap between the woofer and the tweeter. So this is sort of classic design considerations for any sort of speaker, but you want to keep that in mind when you're selecting drivers to biamp in this situation. And last but certainly not least, always run TruePlay. TruePlay will smooth out any of the inconsistencies between the drivers, fill in any gaps, equalize the difference between efficiency or output levels. So it makes a really big difference. One important piece of advice though is if you have a subwoofer attached, always turn the subwoofer either all the way off or keep it fairly low, because if TruePlay hears too much low end, it might say, oh, there's too much there, let me attenuate it, and that will be part of the correction curve. So you don't want TruePlay to be fighting against you. You can keep it on a little bit, maybe below 40% or so that it can deal with room issues. But I would not have it all the way up at your normal listening level, because you might find that the bass will sound really thin. I've so far only covered how to do this with the existing symphonic cabinets, but there's a really great Make article that shows how to take the electronics out of the speaker and actually permanently mount them inside the speaker you're trying to biamp. So check out that article if you're interested in taking it one step further. All right, well, I think this covers every question I've seen in the comments over the last 6 months. I hope this answers your questions and makes it a lot easier when you embark on your own Sonos hacking project. I've had a ton of fun playing with these things, and I'm going to be doing some more projects down the road, but I'm hoping that these wiring diagrams will really get people on the right path. So yeah, we've covered stereo, we've covered home theater, we've covered how to add a subwoofer as a zone, and how to biamp any old passive speakers. So you can see that with this one technique, we can do all sorts of different fun things. So I would say go forth and hack away and let me know how things are going. Share your projects with me and the rest of the community. We're really interested in seeing what you come up with. So thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate you hanging in there till the end. I know this was a long video. It certainly took me a long time to put it all together. So thank you for your time, and please subscribe for updates. Bye.